Despite Vault-Tech's claims to the contrary, not everyone had a better life underground. Some had better lives above ground, others not so much. Today we'll be going through the fates of known settlements in Fallout. Now, if you've played Fallout long enough, you start to realize something kind of messed up. The real main characters aren't the protagonists, it's the settlements, because every single town in Fallout is basically asking one question. How long can human beings pretend life is normal while standing on a landmine? And I'll just go ahead and warn you now, some of these places don't get heroic endings. Let's start with the settlement that basically invented wasteland capitalism, the Hub, selling survival. The Hub is one of those Fallout 1 locations that feels bigger than it can possibly be, not because it's skyscrapers and neon, but because it's connected. The Hub is a trading city, and it becomes a trading city early, founded in 2093 around an oasis and an old town that wasn't hit as hard as everything else. And right away, you can feel what the Hub represents. It's not hope, it's commerce. Because in the wasteland, hope is nice. The thing about though is that hope doesn't move Brahmin caravans. The Hub does. It becomes the center point of a growing network, caravans linking settlements, goods flowing, information traveling with the traders, and this weird early post-war version of globalization happening with rusty rifles and water barrels. And the secret sauce of all this? Good old plain water. Because it's so early in Fallout's West Coast timeline, clean water is basically currency, power, and social stability all rolled into one, which is why the water merchants, the de facto kings of the Hub, matter so much. They're the organization tied to acquiring, transporting, and selling potable and portable water, one of the wasteland's most valuable commodities. Now, here's the part people forget. The Hub doesn't just exist peacefully. It has an internal political arc that is very Fallout. You've got Angus, founder, governor, big early figure, and then, in the winter of 2125, he's assassinated. The very moment that happens, the Hub basically does what any wealthy, highly connected trade city would do when central authority collapses. It starts eating itself. After 32 years of one-person rule, the city falls into chaos. Then open warfare in 2126. The water merchants seize the water tower and declare themselves the sole distributor of what gives the wasteland life and traders meaning. Other groups disagree, violently, and so the Great Merchant Wars kick off for roughly 2 years of fighting. I want you to appreciate how perfect that is for Fallout, because in a world where water equals life, water rights turns into civil war. Obviously, much of this is only covered in the Fallout Bible, but you can feel the remnants of it in the gameplay and dialogue of the Hub in the first Fallout. It's not a random apocalypse. It's a familiar kind of human conflict with higher stakes and fewer lawyers. Probably good that there aren't any lawyers in the Hub anyway. Imagine starting a post-apocalypse town meeting by asking everyone, who actually owns the water? But then you wake up 3 days later in a ditch, because the solution to your question was actually murder. So what's the Hub's fate? This is where it gets interesting, because the Hub doesn't have the one dramatic ending that some settlements get. You can kill it, but Fallout canon typically tends to prefer survival over death. The Hub survives by doing what it always did, adapting its political structure so commerce can keep moving. The Hub is tied into the new California Republic's early formation. Specifically, it's the last independent city-state to ratify the agreement that makes the NCR spring into existence, and it benefits by swapping an oligarchic merchant council for a civil government with elected officials, while caravan companies keep pursuing their goals. So the Hub's fate isn't being destroyed. It's arguably worse. Depending on your taste, it becomes official, regulated, and ultimately, it becomes part of a state apparatus. That sounds like a win, until you remember what that means in Fallout terms. Taxes, corruption with paperwork, the slow death of independent survival as the NCR expands. The Hub is one of the earliest examples of a settlement that doesn't die to raiders or monsters. It survives long enough to get swallowed by the concept of government, which is a very different kind of apocalypse. And if the Hub is the wasteland as a marketplace, then New Reno is what happens when the marketplace gets run by people who treat morality like a myth made up to keep you from having fun. New Reno, unclean criminality. New Reno is Fallout 2's ultimate showcase of the idea that this place is awful, yet it's thriving vibe settlement. That's the first thing you need to understand about it. New Reno doesn't survive because it's good. The city survives because it's useful. It was Las Vegas before New Vegas was discovered. It's a city of vice, gambling, drugs, and most importantly, power brokering. It's systematic organized crime with enough structure that the city keeps functioning. In Fallout 2's setting of 2024-11, two of the most influential families are the Mordinos and the Bishops, with the Salvatores and Wrights as far more minor powers. But the broader picture is that New Reno is defined by its families, their turf, and the way they stabilize the city through fear and profit. And the detail that sums up New Reno's whole vibe is this. Shortly before Fallout 2 begins, Mordino family jet shipments begin arriving in Redding as part of the struggle for control. Control through drugs. That's New Reno in one sentence. Not that they rebuilt, not that they formed a community. No, instead it's that they found a commodity that ruins lives and used it as leverage. Provided not all the families are like the Mordinos, but each has their own unique brand of brutality or corruption present and prevalent. And it's because of that in which the city becomes a key player in the wider regional struggle over Northern California resources, especially because the NCR's currency ends up backed by gold and Redding becomes crucial to trade. So New Reno isn't an isolated sin pit. It's plugged into the economics of the region. It's a parasite city, but parasites survive by staying attached to something bigger. Now, here's the key. New Reno's fate is not a single fate. Fallout 2 has multiple ending slides, and New Reno's future can swing wildly depending on what happens and who ends up on top. There's even an ending where the Bishop family gets a strange blessing in the form of a child who grows up and leads them to victory over the remaining families, then dies later having never known his real father. Your choices matter, but the consequences can be bizarre and personal in ways no one can really predict. But we also have later timeframe hints about where New Reno tends to land by the time you reach the New Vegas era. By 2081, the original families more or less retained power except the Salvatores and Mordinos, and the city is described as being run mostly by the Wrights, while also being contested by the Van Graffs. So if you're looking for the broad strokes of their ultimate fate, New Reno doesn't collapse. It reshuffles. It keeps being New Reno. Different bosses, same city. And that is genuinely one of the darkest settlement fates in Fallout because it implies something. The apocalypse didn't create the city's evil. It just removed the restraints. New Reno is proof that humanity doesn't need vault tech to run evil systems. Given enough hunger, greed, and opportunity, people will build a system that hurts others and call it a business. New Reno is basically the only place in Fallout where you can get stabbed in an alley, and the guy who stabbed you hands you a flyer like, "Sorry about that, please accept our apology by attending our grand opening of a knife fight pit at the casino tonight." Now, here's what makes New Reno interesting instead of just gross. It's a settlement that demonstrates a stable form of post-war power, not just the idea of having a sheriff and laws. There are plenty of towns and locations in Fallout that have the same claim to fame. What New Reno has is the idea of having agreements, bribery, intimidation, and enough mutual fear that nobody presses the big red button. New Reno is political realism wearing a leather jacket. But if New Reno is a city that survives by controlling people, Megaton is the settlement that survives by building a whole identity around one single object. And yes, I mean the bomb. Megaton, built around a mistake. Megaton is iconic, but the reason it's iconic is brutal. It's a town that exists because a nuclear bomb didn't go off. And the first major fate question Megaton asks is, does surviving mean anything if you're living on borrowed time? In the lore, Megaton's crater gets settled by people who either worship the undetonated bomb or tried to seek shelter in Vault 101 and got denied because the Vault's experiment required no one leaves and no one enters, which quickly became a contradictory idea given how many Vault 101 expeditions were sent out into the wastes. That is one of the most Fallout details ever. A bunch of desperate humans show up at a vault door during the end of the world and get turned away because of the lame excuse of sorry, it's just our standard operating policy. So they do what humans do best. They improvise a civilization out of scraps. Locked out of the vault, the settlers use the crater for protection against dust storms, and they build the town around the bomb. And in classic Fallout fashion, not everyone sees the bomb the same way. For some, it's terror. For others, it becomes sacred. And because of that, Megaton becomes home to the Church of the Children of Adam, who treat the bomb like a religious centerpiece. So Megaton's origin story is already setting up a possible fate, because the town's entire identity is this post-tension, shelter built from plane wreckage and scrap, a community built from exile, and a faith built around a weapon that could delete them from existence. And then Fallout 3 puts you, the player, in front of the most infamous settlement fate choice in the series. The quest explicitly frames it as choosing whether to disarm or detonate the bomb, deciding the fate of the town and its inhabitants. That's Megaton's fate, canonically. It is a settlement whose future can hinge on one visitor and one decision. And what makes that so nasty is how real it feels in Fallout's moral logic, because the option of Megaton surviving isn't guaranteed by walls or weapons. It's guaranteed by whether the world decides it's worth letting exist, still messy, still poor, still held together by collective agreement that the Wastelanders still live here now and forever. The psychological point is obvious. Fallout is asking if you see settlements as living communities, or as set pieces you can erase for convenience. Megaton is the only town in gaming history where the home improvement options include fixing the pipes, uninventing the town, or getting swanky digs in it. Now, if you zoom out beyond the player's choice, Megaton's deeper fate theme is about what the Wasteland rewards. Megaton is not rich. Megaton is not what anyone anyone would call powerful. Megaton is simply early. It's one of the first places a Vault 101 survivor encounters, and a large trader, rest, and resupply area, which means it becomes a social hub by default. And that's why its moral choice hits, because Megaton is presented as a functioning settlement full of small lives, routines, and tiny hopes. So the decision to wipe it out isn't tactical, it's personal, and the settlement's fate becomes a kind of litmus test for the world's cruelty. Now we're going to pivot into a settlement that feels bigger than life, because it's basically a country or city-state disguised as a mere city. New Vegas. Lavish luxury. New Vegas is the closest thing Fallout has to a city that refuses to accept the apocalypse as a valid excuse. And it starts with the most New Vegas fact imaginable. The place didn't get glassed the way other cities did, because one ultra-rich man basically prepped for the end of the world like it was a business presentation. Robert House predicted nuclear war decades in advance and redirected Robco's resources into defending Vegas. When the Great War hit, House's defenses still stopped most of the ICBMs aimed at the area, which is an insane sentence no matter how you phrase it, and it's the reason there's even a Vegas left to become New Vegas. The bitter punchline is that surviving the initial barrage didn't mean the city was instantly safe. Even the surviving civilians didn't just magically get a happy ending because the skyline stayed upright. Fallout is really good at that kind of irony. Congrats, the buildings are still here. Now die slower. But surviving the bombs is just the prologue. The real story of New Vegas is House showing up later like a landlord returning to a property that's been squatted in for generations and going, okay, cute, I'm back. Here are the rules. Tribes and groups had been fighting among the ruins until House's return, and once he reasserted control, he basically reorganized human chaos into something profitable. He recruited the biggest tribes willing to play ball, remade them into the chairman, omertas, and white glove society, and that becomes the three families, the casino ruling class of the Strip. The kings and great khans refuse the deal, and the result is the blueprint for Vegas's entire social layout. Winners behind walls, and everyone else living in the shadow of that wall, fighting over whatever crumbs fall off the neon table. House even uses Freeside as a filter, which is such a polite way of saying, I want poverty to be visible, but not close enough to touch my carpet. New Vegas is literally structured inequality, engineered on purpose, and then marketed as freedom, because you can gamble there. Libertarian dictator is still a dictator, guys. And then the Mojave turns into a knife fight between empires, because the city's real value isn't just casinos, it's the power and infrastructure around it. By the late 2070s and early 2080s, the NCR wants the region, Caesar's Legion wants the region, and House wants everyone to keep circling each other forever, because a deadlock is an opportunity when you're sitting in the best chair in the room. The game straight up frames it as a delicate power balance. The NCR can't just steamroll the Strip without exposing Hoover Dam, and the Legion can't make Vegas their capital without leaving themselves open to NCR retaliation. That tension, the sense that Vegas is the prize that could break whoever reaches too hard for it, is why the city feels like it's vibrating the entire game. So what's the fate of New Vegas? Here's where Fallout. New Vegas is brutal in a really fun way, because the city's fate isn't singular, it branches. If the NCR takes the dam again, they celebrate victory, and then negotiate to annex the Strip, Freeside, and surrounding communities, basically folding the Mojave under their banner like it's a new administrative headache they swear they can manage this time. If Caesar's Legion wins, the Strip becomes a conquest parade and New Vegas is occupied, with much of the population enslaved and everyone else living under civilization that feels like a threat disguised as order. If House wins, his Securitron army pushes both NCR and Legion out, and he continues running Vegas as his pre-war glory project. Orderly, efficient, cold. The casinos keep printing money, and the city stays the one place where fortunes flip in a heartbeat, but it's not free, it's managed. And if the Courier goes independent with Yes Man, you can get an independent Vegas where the transition is messy, sometimes outright anarchic at first, sometimes stabilized hard by diverted Securitrons, but either way, the point is that Vegas is no longer being claimed by a flag, it's being claimed by a vacuum, and vacuums always get filled by something. And here's the part people forget. New Vegas is not just a city, it's a machine that runs on belief. House's belief that he can engineer humanity forward, the NCR's belief that bureaucracy is civilization, the Legion's belief that cruelty is strength, the Courier's belief that removing the big powers makes room for something better, or at least something different, and the city changes depending on which belief gets the last word. That's why New Vegas feels like it has a fate, even though you can choose multiple outcomes, because each ending is basically a different answer to the same question. What does civilization look like after the world ended? And do you still call it civilization if it only works for the people behind the wall? Diamond City, big green jewel. Diamond City is the Commonwealth's version of we found a landmark and decided it was a fortress now, except it actually worked. It was founded inside Fenway Park in 2130, and it becomes a safe haven largely because of the big reinforced wall, the one residents literally praise as the wall, with the city's green stadium look feeding into this myth that it's protected by the bones of the old world. Later, it grows into the Commonwealth's largest and most prosperous community. And then, because Fallout cannot help itself, prosperity turns into stratification. The wealthier residents move into the upper stands because, of course, the rich people literally live above everyone else. That's not even subtle. That's basically the set designer looking you in the eye. But Diamond City's fate isn't about whether it survives. It already survived. The real question is what it becomes while it survives. Because it's got the classic Fallout settlement disease. Fear. Not raider fear, not, oh no, there's a Deathclaw fear. I mean social fear. The kind that makes people do awful things and then call it security. There's an entire historical trauma baked into the place. In 2029, a mysterious visitor killed several people, got shot by security, and was revealed to be a synth. And that's presented as a key moment for the Commonwealth's fear of the Institute. That kind of paranoia rots a settlement from the inside out because it turns neighbors into suspects. And Diamond City doesn't just have paranoia, it has leadership that weaponizes it. In 2028, Mayor McDonough is still in power, publicly posing as the city's defender, while secretly ensuring Diamond City doesn't interfere with the Institute's plans. And his cover is actively fraying because people are starting to suspect he's a synth. That's the most Fallout political situation imaginable. Your leader is literally collaborating with the boogeyman, and the city's response is to argue about who is really human enough to deserve a home. And this is where Diamond City's fate starts to mirror real history more than people want to admit, because when fear spikes, somebody always offers a scapegoat. McDonough runs on anti-ghoul politics, and it turns into an ugly purge vibe where the divide between upper stands and the field gets exploited. You get this whole sense that the city's civilization is conditional, and you're only safe as long as you fit the version of acceptable the leadership is selling today. Like it's this shining beacon. And yeah, it has schools and power and commerce, but a jewel can still be set into a crown that cuts into somebody's skin. So what happens to Diamond City? Here's the trick. Fallout 4 doesn't give you one clean ending slide for Diamond City the way New Vegas does. So the fate of the settlement is more like a set of pressure points. We know it's the major hub and stays prosperous. We know the Institute's shadow shapes daily life. We know the city's internal class structure and fear politics make it fragile in a different way than a shack town is fragile. We also know, very bluntly, that things can change when McDonough is gone, because companions can comment that things are looking up around here now that McDonough's gone. That line matters because it implies Diamond City isn't doomed by its walls or its location. It's doomed or saved by its leadership, and the story the residents choose to believe about each other. And that's where your headcanon and your playthrough logic kick in. If the Institute remains a power, Diamond City's future is basically living under a quiet occupation you don't always see, where paranoia never fully burns out because the threat is literally invisible. If the Institute is destroyed, the city doesn't instantly become a utopia. But the biggest psychological weapon in the Commonwealth loses a lot of its bite. If the Brotherhood dominates the region, Diamond City becomes a strategic node in a militarized Commonwealth. If the Minutemen rise, you can imagine Diamond City as the political and economic center of a looser network of settlements, which sounds hopeful until you remember that every hopeful system still has to survive the next person who decides fear is a better campaign strategy than cooperation. The fate of Diamond City is basically this. It keeps standing, but what it stands for is always up for grabs. And honestly, that's scarier than a city that just gets blown up, because a city that survives can keep making the same mistakes forever. Highway Town. Highway life. Okay, now Highway Town is the wild card on this list because it's from Fallout 76's Burning Springs region, meaning it's operating in the early post-war era where the world is still deciding what society is even supposed to look like. Highway Town is built on the hanging ruins of Highway 35 in southeastern Ohio. It's powered by these prominent aerial turbines, and it's self-sufficient in this scrappy, we're doing agriculture on multiple levels because gravity is optional when starvation is on the table kind of way. It's also one of the few sources of good, clean water in Burning Springs, which immediately tells you why it matters. In Fallout, clean water is political power. If you can provide it, you're not just a town, you're leverage. But Highway Town is not civilized in the Diamond City sense. It has no centralized law enforcement or leadership, and the way the world describes is that if you break the social contract, you might get executed. That's not a legal system, that's the town collectively saying, don't make your problems our problems. Mercenary work and bounty hunting are common. It's known as a town of toughs, and the whole vibe is, you can be welcome here as long as you're useful, or at least not actively annoying, which honestly is how a lot of real roommate situations work too, just with less public execution. And what's the fate? Highway Town's fate is vulnerability disguised as swagger. The settlement has been attacked by the Rust King in the past, suffering damage and being forced to rebuild weaker each time, which is such a painfully Fallout detail because it's the slow death that kills towns more often than than one big dramatic catastrophe. It even mentions growth as recent as 2011, and that the town doesn't discriminate about who's welcome as long as they don't cause disturbances, which sounds progressive until you remember that the enforcement mechanism is basically popular rule plus murder if we're having a bad week. There are also ongoing issues with illness born from the rust, and you get those grim little details like residents having a deep, dry cough, which is Fallout's way of reminding you that the environment itself is still trying to kill you even when the raiders aren't. So Highway Town's fate isn't a neat endpoint, it's a tightrope. On one hand, being a trade hub and water source makes it essential. On the other hand, being essential paints a target on you, because every warlord within Brahmin walking distance is going to look at your turbines and your water pumps and think, that would look better with my flag on it. And the scariest part is that Highway Town is what a lot of settlements probably looked like before they either evolved into something like Diamond City or collapsed into a footnote. It's a snapshot of civilization mid-formation, where the rules are being written in real time, and the ink is mostly blood and barter caps. And that was what happened to every known settlement in Fallout. If you want to see what happened to every forgotten survivor in Fallout, click the video on the screen.